Okay, this session is a bit short and sharp, but we're going to be looking at the factors that affect stability within biomechanics. Now, key definition for you to have quite quickly, because it runs all the way through this, is the centre of mass. Okay, now the centre of mass is the point of balance of a body. Okay, now this is really important to us because actually the position of the centre of mass is fundamental to stability. So we are going to spend a bit of time now looking at the factors that allow this to happen, and in particular we're looking at 4. So the first one is the height of the centre of mass. Okay, now the higher the centre of mass, the less stable you are. So it's very easy, if you were stood tall in front of me, it's quite easy to push you back. You're very unstable like that because your centre of mass is quite high. However, if you lowered your centre of mass, and by doing so you need to bend your knees, okay, and feet flat on the floor, you actually become more difficult to push. You become more stable. Now, if we take something like a rugby scrum, we see that happening, where the lower that centre of the mass, actually the more difficult it is to shove the scrum back. As soon as the front row of the scrum, or one of the front rows of the scrum, comes a little taller, so it begins to stand up, then actually it's more easy to push those, it's easier to push them back. So lowering the centre of mass is a fundamental factor in terms of maintaining stability. Now obviously there are limits to that, so you don't lower it down so much, but actually you lie down on the floor, you're very, very difficult to push, potentially more friction than anything else. Okay. The second one that we're going to look at is the position of the line of gravity. Now, if we talk about the rugby scrum again, then we might see that the hips actually stay over the feet. Okay, so you bend your knees, but by keeping your back straight, your hips actually are now in line with your ankles, with the base of your feet. Actually, that maintains stability. So now you're more difficult to manoeuvre, you're more difficult to push away, because the position of that line that's running through, so your shoulders over your knees in the scrum, your hips over your ankles over the scrum, meaning that actually you're more difficult to push away. So the position of the line of gravity. The next part of it is the area of the support base. The more points of contact you have with the floor, the more stable you are. So if we take the start of a 100-metre sprint, with 2 feet and 2 hands, that's quite a stable position. Okay, and has to be stable. If they start to move, then they can be adjusted, make a false start, or indeed asked just to stand up before they set again. So they need to be steady at the start of a 100-metre race. So those points of contact are really important. But what's also quite important is the area of that support base, actually the width of your feet. So the closer your feet are together, or closer your points of contact are together, the less stable you are. The wider that point of contact, or wider the area of the support base, so it might be my feet are past shoulder width apart, it might be that my hands are a little bit further away from my feet, it might be I might have one hand and one foot down for whatever reason. I'm not really sure the sport where that will happen, but ultimately the further that area of support base, the stable you are. Okay, so you often see when people are setting up that their feet go wider than shoulder width, because that would increase stability. Okay, and the final one, no surprise in this one, is the mass of the performer. And obviously the heavier somebody is, okay, the more difficult it is to move them, simply because there's no increased inertia. Okay, it's more difficult, you need a greater force to change that velocity, and if an object is stationary that's relatively heavy, then clearly it's going to need a greater force in order to move it. So we can look at a couple of things on this. We can look at a sumo wrestler just really quickly. I'm going to come to another one that potentially is a better example, but we might as well use it because it's probably easy to see. So what we start to see through all of this within a sumo wrestler, the object of the game is not to get pushed out of the circle. That's the object of the game. So actually they bend their knees to reduce the centre of mass. Okay, so we bend it. That position of the line of gravity, so we have our back straight. So the back is straight. What we don't have by lowering it is simply knee straight but just leaning forwards. Okay, we have to maintain our line of gravity because the knees bend, feet stay flat on the floor, hips over the ankles, shoulders over the knees. So now we have a good line of gravity, a strong line of gravity coming straight down rather than at an angle. The area of the support base, well, they don't tend to put their hands down as far as I'm aware. I might see one hand going down potentially, but their feet are really wide apart, and finally they're very heavy. But actually one that you could use in as a better example, if you like, is take judo, for example. So we see this in judo all the time. So we see exactly the same, that bending of the knees nice and low, really low centre of gravity. So it's very, very difficult to, not only to grab, but also very difficult then to manoeuvre. The positional line of gravity, no different. So our knees are bent, but back is straight, really important. So our hips now are over our ankles and our shoulders are over our knees. So our centre of gravity, our central line of gravity is actually vertical rather than at an angle. That area of the support base, so not only do we have feet nice and wide apart, but we also try to grab in the right areas of the opponent, okay, on the clothing of the opponent. That increases our stability, and obviously then as we get through, that mass is really important. But what we start to see a lot in judo, and it's worth looking at it, what we start to see a lot in judo is sometimes it can appear there's not an awful amount of action going on, because they are attempting to find a point where they have their opponent at their least stable. So there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of attempts, there's almost a lot of feeling out as to whether a move is going to work or not. But very rarely do you see somebody just going in straight away and putting somebody flat on their back, simply because of how stable they are. So it becomes a real war of attrition. So in those instances, a really good example to use, but these are your 4 key areas of stability, and the worksheet can help you now improve your understanding of it.